Okay, so today we're just going to be discussing the 5 major components of forensics. To get started here, the first one is what is the scientific method and why it's important in criminal investigations? What are class characteristics? What are some physical methods for enhancing latent fingerprints? To list 3 types of handguns and how they differ. And what is the process for comparing bullets and firearms evidence to a suspected weapon? To start out, the scientific method, it is defined as a multi-step method by which scientists approach problems. They basically formulate experimental inquiries to validate their conclusions. So the first step is to formulate careful observations. This is highly emphasized, and one must be receptive in their observations and just question the natural world and have curiosity of what's behind them. The second step is to make logical suppositions to explain these observations. Basically, you should try to understand the natural phenomena in the natural world. And here is where we formulate a hypothesis, or also known as a yet unproven explanation for the observations. And it's important to note that a hypothesis must be composed of experimentally testable predictions. With hypothesis testing, basically the controlled experiments, you just create tests that must be controlled. That is, has to be designed so that you're testing one thing in the hypothesis at a time. When it comes to refining the hypothesis, it's basically just to retest it over and over, so you can generate different predictions, and it actually takes some time to discover proper tests to show that a hypothesis is false and that it has to be changed. Now, with some hypotheses, especially the ones that have been tested extensively by different scientists, they can be found to be theories, which is just a well-tested hypothesis, or even natural laws, which is just a generally accepted explanation of a series of phenomena. Basically, this is just a very thoroughly tested hypothesis that is highly reliable. So the importance in the criminal investigation lies in 3 different reasonings. 1, forensic science is indeed a science. Therefore, it allows and follows a scientific method, and it helps to build its knowledge foundation. Secondly, it forms the basis for event reconstruction, basically just crime scene reconstruction. That's just where you take your physical evidence on record and all other available information that's helpful to determine a likely explanation for past events, and you can also use it to rule out possible explanations. Third, it provides a logical and productive basis for investigation. Basically, some investigators that approach a new case, they inevitably form a hypothesis about what might have happened. They tend to narrow in on a suspect and only look at evidence for that suspect that points to them. That's basically what we call an open and shut case. But when they use a scientific method, basically they look at all the evidence found and take their time forming and refining the hypothesis, and they let the data control the hypothesis or their theory. Now the next component is class characteristics. Basically, classification or identification is just to place things into groups according to their basic characteristics, and class characteristics are just those that define a class or category of items or objects to define them, but are not alone sufficient for a definition of individuality. You can basically classify things by using a direct physical match, which is more of a jigsaw fit match, or an indirect physical match. Our next component is what are some physical methods of enhancing latent fingerprints. Latent fingerprints are just fingerprint impressions that just requires more development or even special illumination to show the rich detail in a sufficient manner for comparison. So it just requires more processing. This can be done in 3 methods. 1, powder dusting. It's very old, but it's a tried and true method. for visualizing fingerprints, especially on non-porous surfaces. There's a variety of colors and brushes available. Most commonly, the black or chemist gray powders are more superior in this because they tend to yield more of a uniform particle size and produce better contrast against the background. The second method is the magnetic brush technique, and it's just a variation of the powder dusting, but instead of using powder and a brush, it just uses a magnet and magnetic particles. The third method is the small particle reagent, or SPR. It's just small inorganic particles in a special suspension, and they can just be applied to latent print impressions to just enhance the ridge pattern features. They're typically applied by spraying or dipping, and they're mostly used in evidence that has been wet or recovered from water. The next component is handguns and how they differ. Basically, handguns are usually about a foot or less in length, and they're just designed to be held in one hand or with both hands when fired. The first type of handgun is the single shot handgun, and this is used mostly for target shooting. Since it does have few moving parts, they can be made with high precision and are pretty much very accurate and reliable. Revolvers, on the other hand, are handguns that have a rotating cylinder cartridge holder, and they usually hold about 5 to 9 cartridges, and they allow the weapon to be fired semi-automatically until all the bullets are expended. Like I said, they hold anywhere from 5 to 9 cartridges depending on the caliber. This is basically how it works. When someone pulls the trigger, it causes the firearm to indeed fire, and then a lever turns the cylinder so that a new bullet is in position to be fired. Basically, this mechanism allows the firearm to fire each time the trigger is pulled until all the bullets in the cylinder are fired. Because this is so simple, revolvers are generally considered more reliable than semi-automatic firearms only because they seldomly jam or misfire. Semi-automatic pistols are much like the semi-automatic rifle. Basically, cartridges are placed in the magazine, which fits into the grip of the firearm, and it feeds a new bullet each time the gun is fired. The mechanism is a combination of spring action and expelled gases, and it's just used to eject fired cases and move new bullets into the chamber. Basically, empty bullet cases are ejected with force either to the left or to the right of the firearm, depending on the design. Now, the difference between them is basically in how the cartridges are expelled and how many cartridges they can hold. With your revolver, the cases are retained in the cylinder, so they really don't expel them. But with the semi-automatic pistols, one can hold way more cartridges, anywhere from 8 to 16, and the cartridges are expelled also. So the last component is what is the process of comparing bullets to firearm evidence. One, to start out, you need to do a physical examination of the firearm for safety and physical condition. Basically, you must ensure that there's no bullets in the firearm. You need to look down that barrel to make sure that there's nothing that is jammed, not a jammed bullet, just nothing like that. And you need to note the basic class characteristics like the caliber, the number of lands, grooves, the direction and twist, the make, the model, and the serial number. You then must test for functionality, which is just referring to if the firearm is able to fire a projectile when the trigger is indeed pulled. In order to obtain controlled bullets, you have to use a bullet recovery tank, which is just a tank that is filled with water, and it basically just stops the flight and allows you to recover a projectile when the gun is fired. With the bullet and cartridge or shot shell case comparison, you would use firearm comparison microscope, which is just two reflected light microscopes linked with an optical bridge, and is just used for the comparison of objects by reflecting light. With bullet comparison, you must look at the fine striations on the interior of the land impressions on the bullet. And finally, association of cartridges or bullets to firearm or maker using a database. There's a database known as the NIBIN, which stands for the National Integrated Ballistic Identification Network. Basically, here it just has images of bullets and bullet casings recovered either from the scene of a crime or ones from a tested firearm that are submitted from the lab. And this just allows you to find a correlation between cases, meaning maybe a bullet from this case was once matched with a bullet from a previous case that was entered into the database. It's also important to note that you can look at land impressions, which are just depressions of the grooves in a bullet left by the lands inside a barrel, to find a correlation between bullet to the gun.